Oh, yeah, we're just, man, if you're not in the chat on QSportsTalk.com, you are missing out on just problems being solved. Problems being solved. We've figured out how Judas should tell us if he's coming back or not. It involved cheese. Yeah, you heard me. It involved cheese. I can't even really explain it further than that. You've missed it. Come back. Get there next break, though. We'll be doing more nonsense then. I think nonsense may be the best word to describe what's gone on with conference realignment or whatever we're calling it, because nothing actually happened. So conference not realignment or something as we bring in our next guest, David Hale of ESPN, who's been all over the ACC stuff. I don't know, David, do you want to start on conference realignment or not realignment? Or your tweet the other day that your daughter is stashing bacon snacks in her bed, which I found fascinating, and she may be the smartest 4-year-old alive. I don't know.
Let's just say that one of these topics involves very smart decision-making, and the other one not so much.
Yeah, and somehow the one that with smart decision-making is stashing bacon in your bed. I mean, it's genius. It's genius. We should all learn from her. So
proud dad moment for me.
Yeah, like it's both like proud and like, oh crap, I better find that. I hope she ate it all. Otherwise, we're gonna get rats or something. But no, full credit to you. Full credit to you on that. So here's the question. I get they're gonna eventually share some money on who's good at sports and stuff but did anything useful actually happen in the last 15 days, or are we still essentially where we've been for the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on your definition of useful. I think there's something to be said for the fact that they have gotten this revenue distribution thing over the finish line. I mean, I was at the winter meetings in Charlotte in February for the ACC, and this was effectively a non-starter. Like, it wasn't going to happen. And the initial scheduling for the spring meetings, they had like 30 minutes set aside to talk about revenue distribution. And Michael Alford, among others, was less than pleased with all of that, as you might imagine. Lobs a few bombs into the rooms that create total chaos. And then what do you know? They've got a revenue sharing plan. It's not nothing. It's progress. Now, I think you can ask if it's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound or too little too late or whatever metaphor you want to use. There's probably a good case for that. The ACC is up against it just as every other conference that's not the Big Ten or the SEC is up against it. But this is progress in that it shows, I think, some investment from all 14 schools to say, like, we recognize the problem. We know the status quo is not sustainable. We're going to try to make some things happen. On the other hand, at the end of the day, what will this net most schools? Virtually nothing, probably. Now, if you're making the playoff on a regular basis, it probably helps you. But the fact of the matter is and I can't really stress this part enough, like, it's almost not about how big the ACC's bank account is. It is about how big it is relative to the SEC and Big Ten. And if the ACC is getting more money, that's great, but it's not as great if the SEC and Big Ten are also getting that money. And, if you were to extrapolate out what a 12-team playoff looks like most years, it's one, maybe two ACC teams, and you're probably talking 3 or 4 from those other leagues. And so, in the end, is it a wash? I think that's probably closer to accurate than not.
Yeah, and you look at the big picture, obviously, the two biggest football brands are clearly Florida State and Clemson. Like, there's no way to argue that when you look at anything here over the last decade or more in the league. Like, is Florida State's big problem that, to toss Syracuse in there, that they're getting the same money as Syracuse, or are they just more annoyed that they have no way to catch Alabama? I'd say where are we on that teeter-totter right now?
A little of both. I mean, and frankly, I would add a third line to that item list, which is they were so behind the 8 ball financially due to some serious mismanagement and bad decision-making and lack of progressive thought structures within that athletics department for years. I mean, they're really just starting to dig themselves out of a real mess that was exacerbated by the terrible Willie Taggart hire and COVID obviously doing a number on their finances as well. So they're starting from a place of we need more just to catch up. And then I think the frustration, I don't think there is like animosity towards equal revenue distribution among anyone, because every other league pretty much does this. I mean, the one that didn't was the Big 12, and you see that didn't exactly placate Texas either way. I think, it's looking at it from a long-term vision issue of it's not even just like the $30 to $40 million in a given year that's the difference. It's add that up over 10 years, and you're talking about a quarter to $500 million, and that's something that they just can't abide. And the only way to start scraping away at that differential without leaving the ACC is to say we need a bigger share of the pie than everyone else. And I think Michael Alford, for example, is one that he brings up at least a valid, if not a point that everybody should agree with, but a valid argument that is, we bring a lot more money into this league than Syracuse does. We should get more out of it as well.
And what's interesting about that, and obviously like the SEC and the Big Ten are making a ton more money, but I never hear Ohio State saying that about Indiana, and I never hear Alabama saying that about Vanderbilt or Mississippi State. Is that just because they're so far ahead that it doesn't matter, or what would be the difference there when you look at those examples versus the ACC with FSU and Clemson right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're so far ahead that it doesn't matter, and they see some value in having those other brands beyond, I guess, a pure financial decision. But there's this part of me that thinks if every decision is being made based on money, ultimately, which it certainly seems like that's the direction we're marching to headlong, at some point, somebody's going to start asking those exact questions too. And so it's, I have to think like, Rutgers might be riding high right now with their big checks they're about to get as a member of the Big Ten, but at some point, don't you have to say, why am I splitting this with Rutgers? Why am I splitting this with Indiana? And, early on with realignment, when Texas and Oklahoma announced they were leaving and everybody sort of hits the panic button, a lot of folks that I talked to were bringing this up. And one person in particular mentioned a parallel to European soccer and particularly the Premier League, and how, what drove the Premier League ultimately was they didn't want to have to split up money with all of these other teams that were not really generating it, and they sort of separated themselves. But you also have seen in the years since then this move towards can we have a super league within European soccer? And I wonder if we'll get to that eventually. Like that's the next incarnation of this, where like we're going through the realignment to whittle it down to 2 leagues with all the power and all the money, and eventually we'll get down to one where the best teams from those 2 leagues all leave to go start their own thing too. It wouldn't surprise me. I think that's much farther off in the distance because no one has to have that conversation now. But when money's driving the bus, all you have to do is follow the money, and the logic follows along right behind you.
I almost wish, and David Hale is our guest from ESPN, David, that I wish we could almost jump to that for football only, like now. Skip the nonsense in the middle. Like, get to that in football before you screw up anything else, right? Because at some point, because that's really going to be a football-only thing, it would seem, that, like, before you ruin all the other sports, let's get football over there and maybe save everything else in the process.
I mean, you're exactly right, because it is football that, frankly, is ruining it and also keeping it all alive for everything. I mean,
it's amazing.
The money coming in from football is what's funding everything else. But by trying to wedge this, square piece into a round hole is making everybody's life miserable. And I think. And many people, I think, within the sport would agree with this right now, today, that if you had an entity like, for example, the college football playoff that said, we're going to create our own league from scratch, and then by invitation, you come and join us, and it'll only be for football, and everybody else stays the same for everybody else, I'm not sure how many people would be upset by that. I mean, it flies in the face of some tradition. I'm sure Greg Sankey and folks in the Big Ten might not love it, but at the end of the day, like, it makes much more sense to say, let's set aside this thing that is different than everything else on finances, on Title IX, on TV contracts and viewership, all of these things that make football different than every other sport, set those aside and let's get back to the business of putting on college sports and let football be its own thing.
Yeah, because, I don't know, say that'd be 30 teams or whatever. Like, a lot of teams would not be in that group. You'd still have some pretty good, whatever you'd call it, second-level football between the other teams. That would be, real games that people would care about, which is kind of interesting. So I don't know where it's going to go, but it's kind of wild. And David, we see what Florida State and Clemson and the teams that think they're at the top end are doing. Like if you're Syracuse, if you're Boston College, if you're Duke, if you're Pitt, I don't know who you put in. Like what do you do right now if you're a school like that? Do you just sit there and hang on, or is there something you can do at this point?
Yeah, I don't know that there is. I mean, this is for the ACC as a whole, but particularly when you start talking about those schools, it is choosing the best of some bad potential options. I mean, the best case scenario, I think, for a lot of these schools is to hang on and hope the ACC's grant of rights holds up and you can keep everything as is more or less until the mid-2030s, and you get another decade plus out of all of this, and hope that the landscape has changed enough by then that there's a door that is open to you. Because if things hit the fan, so to speak, today, there is no door open for them. They will essentially go back to being something akin to an American Athletic Conference team. Mm-hmm. That's just the reality. I think that teams that are outside of that group would be wise to invest a ton into trying to put more butts in seats, would be wise to invest a ton into figuring out how to maximize multimedia rights that are outside of the purview of TV. I think that they would be wise to be thinking about what non-linear broadcasting might look like a decade from now and prepare yourself for that eventuality. Again, none of these are good solutions, I don't think. None of these are the option that you want to take. But I think the era of teams being able to sort of ride the coattails of the big brands is eventually coming to an end at some level. And so, you sort of have to hope that you can enjoy as much runway as you possibly can, but be ready to fall off the cliff on the other end.
Yeah, and I'll say, the next suggestion I'm going to say here, it's a non-starter, but I've heard this from more than zero people when talking about Syracuse, and it's specifically in regards to UConn because of what they just did and winning the national championship this year. It's like, well, Syracuse should just do that, go back to the Big East, and then cast football aside. But that's a fiscal death blow, right? To just voluntarily go do that. Like UConn, they got put in a weird spot, and it maybe has sort of worked out. Like doing it voluntarily would be nuts, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that UConn playing in the AAC was making a fraction of what Syracuse is making. So the money that they left on the table by leaving the American was relatively little comparatively. And UConn's athletics department is in a budgetary crisis despite that national championship right now. So, again, part of me hates this because I would love to say, I went to Syracuse. I love Syracuse basketball, and I want to see that be a priority. And I think we should be, I don't want to blow off what college baseball or softball or gymnastics means to fans and athletes in those schools. But everything is being dictated by the bottom line, the dollar figures. And that essentially means football is driving the bus on everything, particularly if you're in a Power 5 league right now. And frankly, if the ACC offered UConn a home tomorrow, UConn would jump at it.
Oh, 100%. And, I think I saw this last week. I think it was North Carolina just won the tennis national championship, and there was a stat floating around. And this is the weird part that gets lost. The ACC is having one of, if not its most successful, athletic season ever, right? And then it just doesn't matter when it comes to this.
Yeah, I mean, Wake Forest has been the team that everybody sort of uses as the punchline of, why is Florida State getting the same as tiny little old Wake Forest? Well, Wake Forest has the number one women's golf team and the number one men's baseball team in the country right now, and it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's weird because, obviously it matters, people care about it, but financially it doesn't matter at all.
Exactly.
It's the weirdest thing. We're getting ready for lacrosse national championship weekend here between the men and the women. There's 8 Final Four spots, and the ACC's got 5 of them. But it don't pay the bills. It don't pay the bills.
It's the equivalent of saying, Hey, let me set you up with my friend Dave Hale. He's got a great personality. You'll really like him. Like, it don't matter. He's got no job. He looks like crap, 20 pounds overweight. That's what people are looking at. It's shallow. It's terrible, but it's reality.
Yeah, go out with Dave, but you might want to bring your credit card to pay for the meal. Right?
It'll be a fun meal, but it won't be free.
Yeah, you've got the Amex Platinum to take care of it. All right, man, this stuff, it's weird. It changes every day and somehow remains the same, and yet we will keep on watching it until something eventually goes down. But, David, always great to chat about it, and thanks so much. I'm sure we'll do it again soon, okay?
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
That is David Hale of ESPN. I feel we have the same conversation over and over, but stuff keeps changing and not changing. It's fascinating. It's terrifying. It's a lot of things all at once. With that, we'll take a break on this hour, brought to you by Burdick BMW. We're back with the 411 in the 315. Right after this is QSportsTalk.com and ESPN Radio.